The Floof Squad has arrived. Fresh off their star turn in the best-selling graphic novel Aurora, Kendall, Linua, Falston, Aaron are now available as enamel pins in our merch shop. And for totally innocuous plot reasons, they all glow in the dark. Grab them while they're in stock, link below. At the outbreak of the First World War in the summer of 1914, the most powerful empires in European history jumped gleefully into the continent's most collectively lethal event since the Black Death. We'll show our enemies a good time, win glory on the battlefield, secure the future of our empire, and be home by Christmas. What the hell were they thinking? And why now, after a century of quiet since the last pan-European conflict? But also, while it's clear that back-to-back world wars had a rather transformative effect on history, what kind of world was lost by that transformation? And that especially is the question I want to answer today. So, we will not be diving into the trenches, chucking poison gas, or inventing the tank from first principles, but instead looking across the continent at the turn of the 1900s to catalog our major players and understand how they collectively engineered the total destruction of their world order. So, to understand the world before the war, let's do some history. The first and most essential thing to understand about Europe in 1900 is that the map was the simplest it had been since Rome. Gone was the continent of free cities, states within kingdoms, or distant exclaves held together by family dynasties. This was empires, and they were big. At a glance, we've got Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the vast but frail Ottoman Empire, with states like Serbia and Italy down a rung on the power scale with ambitions to join the big leagues. Now, speaking of ambition, despite the cultural, linguistic, and structural differences between all of these states, they shared in the notion that they had won, or almost won, everything their state wanted. Britain had the greatest navy on earth and the largest empire in human history. France possessed an overseas empire and the capital of European culture. Italy and Germany each finally unified after centuries of divisions. Austria's Habsburg dynasty united a diverse realm under a single constitutional order. Russia was very big and growing its influence in the Balkans as the patron empire of Orthodox Slavs. And the Ottoman Empire was putting in a passable effort to not die after a century of breakaways from its territory. Hey, small victories. Now, after centuries of varyingly convoluted backstories to get each empire to this point in 1900, they all had valid reasons to believe they were crushing it or going to be very soon. But there is, as it happens, a word for this air of supreme self-assurance, of confidence verging on arrogance. That would be hubris, and I believe it informs every layer of our reading, because the genuine triumphs of turn-of-the-century Europe are inseparable from their swaggering domino chain to disaster. That not only means great power politics, but also culture, ideology, and technology that pushed Europe from peaceable equilibrium into industrial-scale total war. So, keep all these factors in mind as we meet our unlucky players. First off, the British Empire. Following a century of whirlwind colonization, they could take laps around the globe without ever leaving the Crown's domain. With land on every continent and undisputed control of the seas, Britannia's rule over them waves brought a staggering amount of natural resources and wealth, most of which found their way back to the Isles, either as inputs for their mechanized factories or as cash to be cataloged in the financial capital of the world, London. Being conveniently separated from the rest of the continent by the Channel, Britain spent the 1800s playing empire off in the corner on the assumption that Europe's internal hoopla didn't really matter to them. But by 1900, this illusion of splendid isolation was shattered once they realized everyone else was catching up on industrialization and military might, and Britain, diplomatically speaking, had no friends. Meanwhile, social disruptions from labor strikes, women's rights protests, and the very real potential for factional violence in Ireland between unionists and nationalists left this world-conquering empire looking mighty fragile at home. Hopping across to the mainland, we find France. Having spent the last century ping-ponging between monarchies and republics, featuring another Napoleon in charge between 1852 and 1870 in the Second Empire period, get new material, the state reconstituted as the Third French Republic after a walloping by neighboring Prussia that cost them the territory of Alsace-Lorraine, and republic it remained through the turn of the century. Though they speed ran the formation of a new colonial empire in West Africa and Vietnam, the real gem in the republic's crown? That metaphor was the city of Paris. After a century of revolutions, citywide renovations, more wars, restorations, and spiffy new landmarks for a trio of World's Fairs, the city in 1900 was the capital of culture in Europe. Home to exciting new art styles like Impressionism and Art Nouveau, my beloved, Parisians also made art out of new technology in the form of motion picture cinema. Paris in this so-called Belle Epoque was radically imaginative, hyper-modern, and wildly unequal. While the Nouveau Riche lived it up in the height of fashion, much of the city was destitute. Not quite so belle after all, perhaps. Now, stepping slightly east, the single biggest shock to the continent came from a newly formed German empire. As a result of the 1871 tussle with France, the small but mighty state of Prussia unified its German-speaking neighbors into a single nation with an alarmingly high potential for ass-kicking. Prussia's hypermilitarism suddenly had a huge pool of manpower and resources to draw on in a united Germany, and Chancellor Otto von Bismarck was keenly aware of how big a target that put on their backs, so he played a careful game of diplomacy to avoid everyone else in Europe ganging up to batter down his door. But around 1890, the new Kaiser, Wilhelm II, took a more satisfying approach, one that he felt Germany deserved. That meant a colonial empire in Africa, a huge buildup of the navy to make Germany a true world power, and not so subtle hints that they wanted more living space on the continent. Uh-oh. This maximalist strategy terrified the rest of Europe into a military arms race and drew millennium-long rivals Britain and France into a partnership. That, if nothing else, is how you know Germany's rapid ascent spelled danger. Yet, if so powerful an empire was ruled by such an erratic Kaiser, was that not also dangerous? Coincidentally, south across the Alps, the Kingdom of Italy had also unified in 1871, but they, however, did not provoke the same fear as the united Germany, which is... yeah, that's fair. The Savoyard Kingdom of Sardinia had succeeded in liberating Italy from its various Austrian and Spanish overlords, but exciting as that was for the Italian populace, it did not elevate them to the level of a great power, though it does demonstrate the promise and the perils associated with a popular ideology of the day, nationalism. In its purest form, this is the idea that we should have a nation. The we typically being a group sharing a cultural, ethnic, and especially linguistic identity, and nation being one sovereign state free of outside interference. At a glance, the Italian peninsula, unified in government by Italians, should be GG, but there remained pockets of Italian communities in Dalmatia, the Swiss Alps, the Ionian Islands, southern France and Corsica, and Malta. However, much of these areas were multi-ethnic and even minority Italian in some cases. Yet the mission of nationalism demands these so-called irredenta, or unredeemed lands, get added to the state. And Italy was not alone in this, as other new nations, such as Serbia, had bold visions for their future domains and regional influence. Ultimately, the driving force is ambition, which, plot twist, is also the essence of colonialism. Italy played a popular game. As far as the perils of nationalism, nobody was more terrified than the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This dual monarchy, ruled by the infamous Habsburg family, had long since cooled it with the inbreeding and seemingly overcorrected by having the most complicated population makeup of any European power. Sporting a mix of Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Ukrainians, Romanians, Slovenes, Italians, Croats, Serbs, Bosnians, and others, the empire understood the rising tide of nationalism was coming at their expense, especially in the Balkans. This region had belonged to the Ottoman Empire for centuries, but as territories got carved out to make new nations like Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria, the Balkans presented a fluid geopolitical venue to project influence in the Ottoman vacuum. Yet, Austria vastly overplayed its hand, formally annexing Bosnia in 1908 and infuriating ethnic Serbs within their empire and the neighboring Kingdom of Serbia, whose dreams of hegemony over the Balkans would not be stopped by some meddlesome Habsburg. So when an Austrian archduke visited the regional capital of Sarajevo as a show of authority, some stuff went down. We'll revisit that in a minute. On the other side of the Balkan bust-up was the last and by far largest great power on the continent, the Russian Empire. Viewing itself as the heir to the Byzantines and thus the Third Rome, doubt, Russia acted as the patron of Orthodox Christians everywhere, which gave them a keen interest in liberating the heavily Orthodox Balkans from Ottoman rule and propping up friendly states in the power vacuum. So Austria's Serbian nationalist nightmare was Russia's exact strategy. Meanwhile, on the astoundingly vast home front, the overwhelming majority of Russia's 125 million inhabitants lived in the countryside, and industrialization was very slow to chip away at the dominance of agriculture in the Russian economy. So despite Russia's general massiveness, mobilizing a powerful and modern army was tricky, as painfully demonstrated by the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 5, when a European empire got stomped by a foreign power for the first time in modern history and nearly triggered a Russian revolution that same year. But hey, crisis averted, right? Give it 12 years and things will be back to normal. And finally, down in the southeast corner of the continent, coming off a solid century of territory losses and the near total evaporation of its Balkan holdings in 1913, we have the master of the Mediterranean turned sick man of Europe, the Ottoman Empire. They are also here. Cool. So, with our cast established, we can notice a handful of trends. God, the slander. For all these nations, the 1900s brought hopes and opportunities right alongside frustrations and deep fears. This is as true of geopolitics as technology, with industrial innovations changing up the shape of economies, the face of cities, the means of communication and travel, and the instruments for mechanized warfare. Machine guns, dreadnought-class battleships, warplanes, and poison gases were just as much a consequence of this new world as cars and cinema. Meanwhile, all of these states beamed with optimism for their futures while struggling with entrenched internal problems, from nationalism to political grievances to fierce wealth inequalities. Europe in 1900 was in equilibrium, but a fundamentally unstable one, both between these great powers as well as within each of them. So, how did they keep the peace with each other throughout the 1800s, and what finally went so catastrophically wrong? Well, after the Napoleonic Wars, Europe collectively decided, ow, wars and revolutions suck actually, let's not do that again, so they hatched a system to maintain the great power status quo and resolve their disputes through diplomacy. It had several hiccups, but largely worked as intended to preserve everyone's spheres of influence and prevent any shakeup to the balance of powers. If one player started practicing their Napoleon impression, the others would promptly form a coalition to smack him down, such as in the 1853 Crimean War when Russia got grabby in the Balkans on account of that patron empire of all Orthodox Slavs routine, so Britain and France put aside their differences to help the Ottomans preserve their domain. Wild on the face of it, but in service of a stable world order, logical. These alliances were fluid and fiercely pragmatic, which is why Bismarck's policy for the recently unified Germany was do not rock the boat or they'll join up and kick our ass. This whole diplomatic arrangement, known as the Concert of Europe, negotiated several of the century's geopolitical affairs, such as containing the revolutions of 1848, suppressing the Boxer Rebellion in China, and hashing out the mass colonization of Africa, all of which was violent. So sure, diplomacy, but only among the clique of great powers, and always with the overriding objective to maintain Europe's global primacy and keep their established regimes in power. Now, if the esteemed concert was so hung up on balancing their powers, what went wrong? Arguably, two main factors. First being the states outside of the concert who sought the exact opposite of a balance of powers, such as the upstart states in the Balkan Wars of 1912-13, who wanted as much land as they can get and completely ignored the concert's attempts to negotiate a partition. Second was the nimble network of great power alliances calcifying into two rival camps. The German Empire pursued defensive alliances with Austria-Hungary, Russia, briefly, and Italy, resulting in a triple alliance from 1882 onward. After Germany began its big aggressive armament, France signed an alliance with Russia in 1894 to box Germany in and increase their chance of clawing back Alsace-Lorraine from German captivity in the event of a conflict. Similarly terrified by them, Britain made a loose agreement, or entente, with France in 1904 and Russia in 1907 to complete their own triangle of teamwork. The result of all this was hardly a fluid balance, but rather two opposing spring traps surrounded by small nations whose stated goals were to flip the status quo. But I think there's also a secret third thing implicit in all this, which is how the idealistic national romanticism of the 1800s hardened into a kind of cultural chauvinism. Most nations, big and small, thought they had that sauce, that we're so great, we deserve even more, and if anyone gets in our way, I think we can take them. And that is the kind of hubristic arrogance which turns a regional crisis like an archduke getting shot and extrapolates it into empire-destroying continental war. Watch it play out. June 28, 1914. Austria's Franz Ferdinand is assassinated by Slavic nationalist Gavrilo Princip. Austria blames Serbia for the plot, and Germany gives its ally a blank check to punish Serbia however it wants. Austria declares war on July 28, and Serbia's patron Russia mobilizes its army toward the Austrian border. Then Germany escalates, declaring war on Russia on August 1st, and, because of their defensive alliance, France too on August 3rd, crossing neutral Belgium to do so. Britain demands Germany leave Belgium, Kaiser refuses, and Britain declares war on the 4th. Now consider the motivations. Serbia wants a bigger state to call their own, Austria wants to knock their meddlesome neighbor down a peg, Russia wants to wedge further into the Balkans via their ally, Germany wants to kneecap Russia before they fully industrialize, France wants Alsace-Lorraine back more than anything else on planet Earth, and Britain wants to stop Germany from overtaking their navy. Everyone wants something, and think this is their chance, their excuse to do it in self-defense. That's why within 1 week of Austria's move, the entire springtrap had sprung, and the great powers embarked gleefully upon mechanized total war, soon to be joined by the Ottomans and Italy. Now I know this looks messy, but don't worry, it'll all be over by Christmas.